Does my degree need to be related to English teaching? I can totally understand why I would be rejected. And I was. Over 50 times. Maybe more than 50 times, but I was rejected from a lot of English teaching jobs. And I'm just speaking from experience. I'm going to answer the question I get asked most often, which is how to become an English teacher in Japan as a Filipino. I think the process might be different, so this is just what I experienced. So in Japan, there's eikaiwa, like what I am, like English conversation schools, and there's also ALTs, and there are also teachers that work at, international schools, kindergartens especially. I was directly hired, by the way. I didn't go through a recruitment agency because I was already in Japan, and thankfully it all worked out for me, but I'm one of the lucky ones. And I hope that you respect my privacy when I tell you guys I don't really want to say where I work right now. So yeah, I hope you guys understand that. So the first thing that I needed was a resume that showed a little bit of teaching experience. So before I left the Philippines, I didn't have any. I was working in an advertising agency, so of course I wouldn't have any teaching experience. But when I got to Japan, one of my first part-time jobs actually, was teaching English to children in an after-school program. So luckily I had that. Next, I needed to show my transcript of records from De La Salle. I needed to show them that my courses were conducted in English. I also had to give my diploma to give a certificate for English teaching, which you can easily take online. So it's a course. It's about 100 hours or 120 hours, I think. Yeah, that was it for the most part. I think it was really easy for me because I was already living in Japan. But I think the hard part came later, and I'll tell you guys why in a bit. So normally, if you want to be an English teacher and you're living in the Philippines but you want to move to Japan, I think the best way would be to go through a recruitment agency. And the biggest reason for this is that if you go through a recruitment agency, you will 100% be able to get your OEC, which is a document that you need to be able to come back to Japan after you take a vacation in the Philippines. So the reason why, or the biggest merit of going through a recruitment agency in the Philippines, is that it's already verified by the government. A few years ago, I think the government came out with a rule that almost every company that employs a Filipino needs to be verified by Polo or POEA to make sure that the employee isn't being exploited or anything. I think that was the biggest reason why the government did it. And because of that, for other Filipinos who get directly hired while living in Japan, and if for some reason their employer isn't willing to go through the procedures, they might not be able to get their OEC, meaning after they take a vacation in the Philippines, they might not be able to come home to Japan. Which sounds a little complicated, and it is. I don't understand it fully. So if you know more about it, please leave it in the comment section down below. I would really love to learn more about this. If you're directly hired, congratulations. It's really difficult to be directly hired because of the OEC restraints on us Filipinos. But if you are directly hired, please make sure that your employer is willing to go and get verified, because they should. Because otherwise you won't be able to come back to Japan after you go home to the Philippines. The next question that I was asked was, how is it like already being in Japan and finding an employer to be an English teacher? So, like I mentioned a little earlier, it was quite difficult to find an employer who would be willing to sponsor me. And I think the biggest reason was because of that new rule that they'd have to go and be verified, and it would take time. And can you imagine trying to decide between somebody who needs the employer to do that and literally thousands or hundreds of other applicants who don't need you to do that for them? I can totally understand why I would be rejected. And I was. Over 50 times, maybe more than 50 times, but I was rejected from a lot of English teaching jobs. Had I gone through a recruitment agency in the Philippines, I think the story would have been very different. But then again, I wouldn't have teaching experience, so it's kind of catch-22. I just tried to make do with the cards that I was given, which was try to find an employer, try to make sure that they would be okay going through all the government processes, and I was able to. But yeah, I'm really lucky. That's all I have to say about that. Another question that I get asked most often is, does my degree need to be related to English teaching? Speaking from experience, no, I don't think so. I did graduate with a degree in organizational communication, which is by no means related to education at all. So I don't think it really matters. But I do think that that is the bare bones of what you will need to get a working visa in Japan. You need at least a bachelor's degree. You also need to prove to immigration that you can speak in English, which is normally in the form of a transcript or a resume. I think the hardest part about becoming an English teacher in Japan for a Filipino is actually finding an employer who will hire you. And I'm just speaking from experience. I mean, if your experience is different, that's totally fine and it's valid. So yeah, that's basically what I went through, and it was really difficult. And had I not found my employer, I probably would have had to go back to the Philippines because my student student visa was running out of time. Another question that I get asked most often is how it's really like teaching English. And again, answering this question is different for everybody, but at least for me. So I think the biggest tip that I can get is to make the student view English as a part of their life and not just a subject that they're studying. That way, they'll be more interested to immerse themselves in English and get better at it. Similar with me and my Japanese. I think if I realized that sooner, I'd be a bit better at Japanese than I am now. Not good by any means, but it's helped me sustain my interest in learning Japanese. So, for example, I have a student who loves watching movies and they spend their weekends on Netflix. What I do is I normally give them a list of recommendations for Netflix movies in English, and sometimes they also give me recommendations for movies in Japanese that I can watch. So it's kind of a win-win situation. I think when you're able to make them see English not just as a subject, but as something that they can use for the rest of their life, they become more motivated to learn English, I think. Every student is unique and they respond to feedback differently, so learn and talk to them first and see how they react when you give them some feedback. Some students really appreciate it when you tell them that it's wrong flat out, but others would like you to be a bit more subtle. And if you can't read the air or, check how they react, it could cause friction down the line. So I would say be very sensitive to how your student is reacting, especially in an eikaiwa setting when it's one-on-one. And I know it sounds like such an obvious answer, but it's still good to remember, I think, as a teaching tip. And I think the last teaching tip, oh my gosh, it's so sunny. But I think the last teaching tip that I would give would be to try to find some common interests with your student maybe, and try to remember as many details about their life as they tell you. For example, I notice that students really appreciate it when I bring up stuff that they've talked about in previous discussions. That way it shows that you're really listening and it gives a more interpersonal approach to your lesson, especially because I'm in an eikaiwa and it's one-on-one all the time. I think they really appreciate it when I remember the little details like, oh hey, you mentioned last week that you were going to do this. How was it? And I think it serves as a great icebreaker. But remember that not all students like that, so it really depends on how much they share with you and how much they feel comfortable with you. And you should be able to feel that as a teacher, or try your best to feel that as a teacher. I'm not perfect by any means and I make mistakes all the time, but I hope that those tips help you. So thank you again so much for watching. I know it sounded a little depressing with the whole rule change and OEC thing, but OEC, EOC, I always mix up those acronyms. But yeah, I hope it helped you a little bit, and thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.